guy. All right, anyone seeing anything on the screen remotely?
Looks good.
Amazing. All right, well, welcome everyone. We're in December, we're in the home stretch. Very excited to be here today, talk about PMMA, which, anyone raise your hand if you've ever specified or used or come across PMMA? Cool, perfect. Welcome everyone online, including some AIA Potomac Valley members and remote Grimm and Parker officers. I'll try not to forget that you're here as well. I guess if you have a question, you have to just shout it out. Let's get on with it. Uh-oh. It's not good. That's not good. Larry. Didn't seem to go anywhere, or that one. So I always like to start with this slide, a nice uplifting slide about the industry we all work in. 40% of all building-related problems due to water intrusion, 70% of all construction litigation to do with water intrusion. Roofing accounts for about 2% of project budgets. And a lot of firms I speak to say, yeah, that's 15-year-old data, it's probably even worse now. So just to kind of locate everyone, everything we do is trying to reduce this number. And sometimes that means you might have to increase this number. A little bit about me. I was a landscape architect. I practiced in Europe and the US for 20 years. In 2015, I joined Furbish, which some of you may be familiar with, a green roof contractor in Baltimore. Actually came here and did a lunch and learn in 2015, but we'll get to that. 3 years ago, SOPREMA acquired Furbish. And last year, I left Furbish, moved to the Hudson Valley in New York State, near where my daughter lives. And since then, I've been an AEC rep, which means I'm a salesperson, but I don't have to talk to roofers. So it's really the best of both worlds. When I told my kid 10 years ago I was leaving the design world and going into sales, she's like, Dad, how are you going to do that? You're so socially awkward. And, you know, if you're sitting there going, God, this guy's awkward, you're not the first person to think that, okay? By the way, all those 6 boys in the picture were the same age. And so let's just say I'm a late developer. We're looking forward to getting on your project here at Barry Farm. This is a picture from January or February of this year. Here it was in June, and this is the middle of October. So probably springtime, we might be up there and putting a green roof on. If you recognize your name here, give yourself a pat on the back. It means you've been here for a good while, and you agreed to come to a second one of my lunch and learns. Has anyone heard of SOPREMA? So all I'll say is this. We're a small, big firm. We're family owned, which has some upside and some downside. For the most part, it means that the money that the company has usually gets reinvested in the company rather than going to private equity who are standing there with their hands out. We really kind of invented the idea of building a roof in a factory and then bringing it to a building and putting it on the building in 1908 when we were founded. Prior to that, as you know, all roofing was basically mocked asphalt built in place on the roof, a bunch of layers of felt, and you just build up the roof. We've expanded what we do. We take the technical side very seriously, and we have R&D places around the country. And really the important thing is that not every contractor can just go to a store and buy our stuff and put it on your roof. We have a very rigorous training program to make sure that the contractors are doing everything the right way. Like I said, $5 billion, you know, they're much bigger industrial firms, but it's not nothing. We have 10,000 employees. Really, what it comes down to, from my perspective, is doing more than one thing on a roof. Right? We just don't have the luxury of space or unlimited resources to basically just give a roof one job to keep the rain out. Really important that mechanical systems, you know, stormwater facilities, energy creation, blue roof maybe, and obviously amenity space, all very important. Then on Barry, this is actually Barry Farm 1B, looking across, and I think you guys are right this way. The blue roof is like a green roof, but it's for stormwater detention rather than retention. So it's basically a big puddle on a roof, but you control how long you keep that puddle on the roof before it drains out. Complicated, but sort of serious. We don't need to know about the mammoth, except to say these little guys are not elephants. I'm sorry, they're actually woolly mammoths. And if you'd like to go on our website, you can find out all about that. Last thing I'll say, SOPREMA is always written in capital letters because it's an acronym. Anyone feel like trying out the high school French here? No, fair enough. Let's just say it means Mammoth Waterproofing Products and Coatings Company. We keep it as our emblem to just remind ourselves that if we don't adapt, we'll be dead. Let's say 13 years ago, we had 2 factories. Now we have 8, and we're actually building 3 more factories here in the US right now. So we're growing, and we're embracing the concept that we're part of a community that's building things. And we really want to reinforce our expertise. Absolutely amazing how much expertise there is in a big company like SOPREMA. So, PMMA. We're going to talk about PMMA and how you might be interested in using it. We're an accredited deliverer, or whatever, the presenter. And this course is really about waterproofing problem solving. I'm just going to figure out kind of where PMMA came from, different ways you can use it, and then just kind of discuss when we say problem solving, what does that really mean? And then finally, we want to really, the idea is that we want you guys to feel comfortable saying, oh, this might be a good place to use that system. So, polymethyl methacrylate. I'm not a chemist by any stretch of the imagination, but basically the chemistry is about 100 years old. It's a German chemist, Otto Braun, came up with it, but they came up with like a rigid sheet, which is a little bit different to how it's applied to the roofing industry. Anyone think of a good reason why in the 1930s a rigid, lightweight, water-resistant material might have been useful? Yeah. So it's very light compared to glass. It's stronger than glass, and it's able to be molded pretty easily. This actually, my colleague Sam, who previously 15 years ago had his own contracting firm, was hoping to give this presentation. He wasn't able to do it. But this guy is his grandfather, working at the Roman Haas plant in Bristol, where at the beginning of the war, it was just like, all right, start making this stuff, start forming it, we're going to need it. And since he was going to show you his grandpa, I'm showing you my grandpa on the left. He was a mid-upper gunner in a Lancaster bomber. And unfortunately, his plane got shot down over northern Germany in 1943. And there he is with 3 of his colleagues. This guy in particular lied to the Air Force and told them that he was 18 and he was only 16 when he enlisted. And he died in that plane crash a year later. So his headstone actually gives his accurate age. So we talked about it being lightweight, durable, and water resistant. That was the initial kind of qualities of this material. And then as people started using it, it's like, oh, wow, this stuff lasts a long time too. It doesn't seem to be hampered by UV degradation, which, as you know, harms a lot of things, including 56-year-old skin if you don't put enough lotion on. And it's also a very hard material in the right chemistry. So you're familiar with many of these, I'm sure, you know, perspex, plexiglass, lucite. A lot of times you think it's glass, but it's not. First time it was used in commercial roofing in the Olympic Park, 1972. So this whole roof is rigid panels of PMMA that are kind of formed to create that shape, but then not flexible. So water resistance, obviously, when you're thinking about a roofing material or waterproofing material, that would probably be at the top of the list. Heat resistance, pretty much second, because as any of you know who've been on a roof, it's not the same as being on the ground. You know, it's windy, it's highly exposed, it's just a different environment. And so, and a severe lack of shade for the most part. And of course, we want our roofing materials to be tough and durable. And in many instances, you know, you can think of plenty of examples where resistance to oils and other chemicals might be a really valuable component. So I think that Baltimore, I'm not sure if this is Baltimore, but I know for sure that the aquarium in Baltimore is PMMA enclosed. Thousands and thousands of tons of water in there. And, you know, it basically lasts. Probably seen maybe some of you even have a fire table. That's not glass wrapped around it, it's PMMA. So the stuff is highly flexible. You know, those guys, ladies with the lab coats on can adjust the chemistry to make the material do different things. But let's just call it flexible. And then any of you ever been to an ice hockey game or played, I mean, that's what's going on there. The thing that's stopping a puck whacking you in the face or indeed a ice hockey player crashing into you is PMMA. I mentioned this, the resistance to oils and grease and all that kind of stuff is just one of the qualities of this material. So how would you use it? Because it's so flexible in terms of how you can use it. There are a bunch of different ways you can use it. We're really today talking about this being a cold fluid applied waterproofing or roofing system. Remembering that roofing is controlling, the environment in the absence of hydrostatic pressure, and waterproofing is controlling the movement of water in the presence of hydrostatic pressure. Some of it's water shedding, some of it's waterproofing. There are a lot of terms, but basically you can use PMMA underground, on the roof. You can use it in a conventional assembly or an inverted or protected membrane assembly. And a lot of times what we see is people using it as an add-on or an enhancement for details where the complexity of the roof is just such that, and we'll get some picture in a minute, that roofers actually want to use it, and the design community is like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, let's use that, and we'll get some pictures. But before all that, it can be used as a coating. Like you could say, oh, this concrete's looking a bit worn, not that it is, but if it was, you could coat this with one layer of PMMA, no reinforcement, and you would basically have a new surface. So it can be used as a coating, in a parking garage or something like that. Once you start using it, this is a non-reinforced coating. So let's say this is a concrete parking deck. Put down some sort of primer depending on exactly the condition of the substrate, and then a layer of PMMA, just 0.5 millimeter thick, 20 mils, something like that. Now, partially reinforced is when we use mortar to create like potentially falls in a situation where, let's say we've got ponding water, you might be able to fill up that low area with the mortar and then cover it all with excuse me, cover it all with PMMA and end up with a partially reinforced system. Of course, you always have the option to add some kind of finish on top of the PMMA. And over there, I've got a bunch of samples, so maybe afterwards, it's a bit hectic passing them all around. But you can kind of see the difference between a reinforced and unreinforced. Yes? It's a good question. I think this is sort of a weird title because it is a good question. I was looking out this morning going, is the mortar the reinforcement? I think the mortar generally, like if you had cracks in the substrate, you would use that mortar or some sort of paste. But the reinforcement is really what happens. And I will just pass out a piece of this. Yeah, I mean, that's the stuff that makes it go from being a coating to a roofing system. And so again, the substrate, some sort of primer, and then within a few minutes, resin, fleece, resin. And this stuff, one of its downsides, which also a benefit, is that things happen pretty quickly with PMMA. It's basically rainproof within 30 minutes, which is great. But that also means that if you mix up a batch 30 minutes later, it's really not going to be workable anymore. So there's a little bit of understanding from the roofer's standpoint exactly how this goes down. You know, this project is a fire training facility in New York City. And it's basically training firefighters how to deal with fires on a ship. And so the roof is entirely PMMA. And, you know, they set chemical fires here, you know, empty a 50-gallon drum of oil here, and then someone lights it up, and then they tell the firefighters go and deal with it. The beautiful thing is that PMMA sticks to almost anything, with a couple of very important exceptions, but it really sticks well to itself. So if this roof gets damaged, you know, or if they end up saying the only way into this ship deck is to cut a hole here, you can cut a hole in it, you can weld the steel back, you can put on more PMMA resin, fleece, resin, and you're essentially back where you started. You know, we see this used a lot down in parking garages, especially when you start using colors and things like that, because a coating sometimes, you know, some of those polyurethanes or acrylics, like the color might be broadcast over the top, but it's liable to kind of lose its real color over time, especially with cars driving all over it. Or anyone's PMMA, when it's used the traffic coating, can incorporate color, and it's through the entire depth of the material. So it really doesn't change color. A lot of times it gets used in a sort of decorative way, which, you know, is fine. Like if you're a big college, you want to put your logo on the roof of this big building, it's a pretty good way to do it. I know that we say there's an unlimited color palette, and there really is. SOPREMA recently bought a small batch to go with the big batch plant, but also this super fancy scanner. So you could take this green color, you know, cut a little bit out, send it to our factory, and they would match the color. And then they could mix up a small batch, like probably a pallet load, something like that, and give flexibility to do whatever you want. Of course, the other way to do it is not to use a colored PMMA, but to actually broadcast some kind of aggregate, colored aggregate over the PMMA, and then the roof kind of takes on that color. So really two options. So PMMA, when it comes to the job site, is usually in a 5-gallon bucket, and it'll last for a year just sitting there minding its own business. What you have to do in order to get things, you know, to turn it into PMMA is to add a catalyst. And the catalyst is the thing that initiates the chemical reaction that within 30 minutes or so will turn this into a waterproof, seamless membrane. So there's no heating of the material required. You can install it, like as long as it's above freezing, anything above about 35 degrees, all the way up to 95. So you've got a pretty broad temperature range. And as I said, once it's cured, that resin forms a monolithic membrane. I think this is a video. Let's all keep our fingers crossed that it plays. But you'll see that this is a guy applying it, so you can just get a sense of like what the material feels like. Looks like we had a really nice song going on here, but we'll just have to enjoy the silence. So you remember back in the 30s, it was a highly rigid material. Same chemistry with a couple of tweaks. Now you've basically got a flexible membrane that takes 30 seconds to turn into, 30 minutes to become rainproof. You know, we see a lot of uses like this, you know, on top of a hospital, a helipad, you know, very important that that's highly visible. Obviously, a helicopter landing is not nothing on a roof membrane. So yeah, I'm sorry, it's 23 degrees. So it can actually be below freezing and this stuff still works. And like, good question. Not sure. I'm guessing air temperature. So good question. I will try to find that out. Yes. I need to repeat it. Sorry, I forgot that. So your question is kind of, can you, if you install it out of that range, what's the impact? Is that right? Boy, I wish Sam was here because he would know the answer to that. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think from our perspective as a manufacturer, we'd say if it's more than 95 degrees, don't install it. But if a roofer says the GC is going to fire me if I don't, you know, install this bit of roof today, and it's 96 degrees, I don't know. But that's a good question. I will find out. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, and for those of you online, the second part of the question or an answer was, you know, maybe it'll just cure more quickly than it would if it was in the temperature range. I don't know 100% if that's the case, but sure. And I do know that the hotter it is, there's a kind of matrix on our buckets that say if the temperature's in this range, use this much additive to get the process going. And as it gets hotter, I think you need less of it. So as far as, you know, are there any downsides to it? It doesn't have a whole lot of VOCs in it. In fact, if any, because I actually have some in my mouth. We do have an option. It doesn't smell great. That is one of the downsides, but if you're on a roof, okay. And it's not a permanent thing. Once it's cured, that smell goes away. But certainly if you're working on a re-roofing project, let's say at a hospital, and they're like, no, the hospital's still running, we're just getting a new roof, then there's an option to use PMA, which is polymethacrylate. So it doesn't have any methyl in it, whatever that means. But the fact it's got a much lower odor, so less likely for the air conditioning kind of system to pull that odor into the building. So how can it be a problem solver? You know, this is a project with a bunch of pipes, right? Very close together. Hard to imagine that a roofer could execute that detail, you know, with modified bitumen sheets or with a PVC membrane. It's just hard to get those boots to wrap around. There's so little space and there's so many of them. It's just a time-consuming exercise. Yes? Super question. And just for the others, the question is, how does PMMA integrate with other roofing membranes? The answer is it sticks really, really well to modified bitumen roof. It sticks pretty well, but the surface prep is a little bit annoying for PVC. And it does not stick at all to TPO or EPDM.
Upstairs in the bedroom.
Hello? Oh, fair enough. It is a really good question. I do a fair amount of work in New York, and where we see it used there a lot is on modified bitumen roofs. And I think there might even be a picture or two. Some other examples, right? This top left corner with all these copper pipes. I mean, that would just be a horrendous detail to try to execute with anything else. PMMA is self-terminating, meaning you don't have to end it somewhere and then cap it with a termination bar. You just bring it up the wall, and you can kind of see in this middle picture, the reinforcement fabric stops, ideally about 1/4 of an inch under where the PMMA stops. You don't really want PMMA all the, as far up as they want. We like to keep it nice and neat. But this fabric wraparound, you paint the PMMA on here, then you kind of press the fabric into it, and it's kind of gooey and like it doesn't squish out, but you can compress it, and then paint the second layer of resin over the top. And just to make sure there's no reinforcement fabric kind of poking out beyond the PMMA, we just say, take the PMMA another 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch above the fabric, and just stop painting. And the adhesion is such that once it's on there, it's kind of on there. And, we have a little sample over there with the PVC pipe, and you can dig your thumbnails into it and see what you think, but it's pretty sturdy stuff. The other thing it's great at is standing water. I said earlier, you can use it as part of a waterproofing system. We have a project in Pennsylvania, a hospital getting re-roofed, and you can hardly believe how much stuff is on that roof. It's hard to see any of the roof because there's so many vents, conduits and ducts and all sorts, and it has standing water on it. And so we kind of worked through a few options and eventually just said, look, it's not a very big building. Why don't we just do PMMA? So then we had all that discussion. The owner got all excited that we were going to be able to do it. And we got to the odor. And so we said, all right, it's fine. We can use PMA, just as good, probably costs a bit more. And they're like, we don't, that's not the issue here. The issue here is having a critical facility that needs a new roof. It's holding water, and we need to get it fixed without disrupting operations for the rest of the hospital. So in that sense, it's kind of the last thing you get to. It's not necessarily a good starting point because, 100,000 square foot warehouse for TJ Maxx, if you go to the owner and say, hey, how about PMMA? It's really great stuff. You definitely won't get a leak here. When they see the price, they'll say, you guys are crazy. That's not the sort of roof we need here. But if you're detailing a data center, same size, and they lose $50 million a day in revenue if the thing goes down, then you might say, look, let's do all the flashings in PMMA so we really aren't going to have any problems. Yes, Brian. Sure. The most accurate way I can describe it is on a real project that we had last year. And it was about a 6,000 square foot like environmental education building at a private high school in Pennsylvania. And, you know, they're using mass timber decking. It's like a real showcase building. And the architect's a little anxious because they've never used mass timber before. And no one's, you know, it's not such a common structural system that anyone's like super comfortable about coming up with a solution. So we priced it out both ways. And, you know, instead of being, I think the PVC version was about, and this is for the whole assembly, right? Vapor barrier, insulation, whatever. I think the PVC was about $6 and the PMMA was about 12 per square foot. So, you know, double a PVC roof. Where we really see it being used a lot is when you don't need to use it everywhere, but boy, you don't want those things to leak, you know, and there's an area like, I mean, I don't know what, like this, where it's just so, I mean, in my mind, it's so obvious. It's like, that's worth the money right there. You know, my New York colleagues tell me when they give this presentation, like 3 months later, they say all these specs come out from the architects, you know, PMMA roof. And they're like, wait, you don't need the whole thing to be PMMA. You can use it judiciously and it really provides some value. And often there, like now they have roofers who's been using it for a few years. And obviously real estate value there, like here, is high. And no one wants to be on that second slide, you know, the 70% of litigation. So roofers come back to the design team and say, actually, instead of using a pitch pan or whatever, we'd really like to use liquid flashings. And in that case, actually, the cost isn't really much different because, you know, one guy with a bucket and a duffel bag or a backpack can basically install, you know, start installing it on their own. You don't need cranes. You don't need, you know, heaters. There's really no infrastructure, literally a handful of tools and you're up on the roof fixing. Yes.
Quality control. Staying at the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Passed around.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was that the middle picture shows some kind of lumpy work, which is there. And the sample that we passed around also shows a certain amount of variation. So what is the quality control protocol, I guess is the term. And really it comes down to training. You know, I'm not going to pretend that you're going to get a glassy, smooth surface, like down on a parking deck or something that's been perfectly poured. It's basically going to telegraph the substrate because it's not that thick. So if you had, let's say, I don't know, some sort of expansion joint or anything, a crack that had been kind of fixed with mortar or something like that, it's going to kind of show up. But in terms of quality control, what we really want to do is make sure that the contractor gets their hands on it before they're on the roof, which means, you know, we go to them. I have technical reps all over the place, and I'm sure this is the same for all manufacturers. You know, you don't want your stuff being installed by someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Absolutely critical. And so, and I know I've used the term painted on, and really I get my knuckles wrapped for that because painting implies kind of this, you know, and really when you're installing it on a flat surface, you know, you dip the roller in and you kind of smush it, and then you dip again, and then you smush the next bit. You're not going back and forth on the same area. So there will be a certain amount of variation. But having said that, you know, the entire thickness is probably less than I bet it's less than 100 mil with the three, you know, resin, fleece, resin. And you can imagine if you were wrapping this pipe with a resin, you know, pre-cut resin thing. Let's see. You know, sometimes we have these with the little fingers cut, so you wrap that around whatever it is, and then these guys go horizontal on the roof surface. Well, you can just imagine that when these are horizontal, sometimes there is a finger and sometimes there isn't, and you know you are going to end up with that. Things like balconies, like in some high-end condo or something like that, if everyone has a 6-foot wide concrete balcony, yeah, you've got to decide, do we want it fully reinforced, which is just tougher, or is a single layer as a coating going to suffice? The coating, perversely, is kind of cleaner looking because it doesn't have that, you know, lumpy fabric within it. So, good question. Here we go. I hit it. Yeah, so we talked about ponding water, you know, there aren't any other coatings. If this was a re-roofing possibility of a project, we would push away from any sort of thoughts about polyurethane. It's just like, that's not going to do well with ponding water. If we can put PMMA down, it really doesn't make a blind bit of difference, as long as we have half an hour without ponding water. And then, you know, water features, fountains. Like this one looks like it's a grade, but starting to see quite a lot of water features up, you know, rooftop amenity spaces, that kind of stuff. And then the pitch pan, I mean, this entire assembly nearly always is excluded from a roofing warranty. It's considered a sort of maintenance item. And so, you know, it's just, if there's a leak and it turns out that it's coming from here, well, the manufacturer is like, you know, that's on you guys to keep up with the maintenance on that detail. I mean, I don't love that, but if you use PMMA, it is part of the roofing system and therefore part of the roofing warranty. Self-terminating, we talked about, you know, I don't love the way that's sort of a little bit loose out here. I'd love to see that much tighter to the fabric, like a 1/4 inch max is what we say. We just don't want a kind of free form PMMA spreading, you know, way beyond where the fabric is. And penetrations, again, you know, it's just so easy to do. That's the key. And I mean, this, you know, these are not AI images. These are actual roofing conditions. And I mean, the idea of wrapping that with anything really, you know, TPO, PVC, EPDM, I mean, just so many seams and cuts and dog ears and just one thing over another. It's like perfect use for PMMA. And again, this one, I guess we really like that picture. And then low flashing heights, which really is a kind of thing in the re-roofing world, which I don't know if you guys get involved in projects like that very often. You know, coming from 20 years in the green roof world, it was kind of eye-opening to me. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, because it always used to be, we would be looking for a green roof, and 1 in 100 projects that went out on the street had a green roof. Maybe in DC it was 1 in 5, maybe it's 1 in 1 now, but you know, every building has a roof. 100% of buildings have a roof, otherwise they're not really buildings. And so there's just this enormous array of projects, and re-roofing is about half our business. So, you know, you get to a situation where it's like, oh, we got to put a new roof on this oldish building that was built to a different code. Now we get there, and instead of having 4 inches of insulation, we need to have 6 in order to meet code. And now the insulation's like right up against the door threshold. I don't think that's the situation in this one. Maybe that was just there was some good reason for it. But in order to be able to just capture that within the waterproofing assembly, even when you don't have a whole lot of room to play with, really important and a super helpful thing. So this is kind of what I was talking about, where, you know, at some point a decision was made, right, we're using modified bitumen roofing in a conventional assembly, but we do have, you know, a dozen railing penetrations that go all the way down to the deck. And, you know, there was some discussion, but pretty quickly it's like, yeah, we're going to do PMMA, bring it up the metal, terminate it on the railing, and then bring it out, you know, 12 inches off that penetration all the way around. And, you know, literally this is one guy with a roll of masking tape, a paintbrush or a roller, some fabric and a bucket. And, you know, you just knock these out one after another. Yes. So the roofing, the question was, in the top right picture, what's the sequence, right? So yes, in this case, roofing gets installed, but they just don't have to detail all these penetrations. You know, they probably stop it a few inches inside that line of the PMMA and just stop it there. And then the PMMA comes in over the top. And probably the best, you know, adhesion for PMMA is something like modified bitumen rolls. It's just, it's got that kind of granularity where they're embedded. And so it's not like they're loose rolling around. And so the substrate, obviously, as you guys know, is always critical, right? And if the substrate's messed up, then it doesn't matter how good the material is, you're just nowhere. So sequencing there, you know, and in that case, like time's important, right? The roofer's trying to get off the job. Basically, once the modified bitumen's installed, you know, it's ready to go. Like these seams probably had a torch on them, right? So there's a certain amount of latent heat, but that would dissipate surely in a day. And so, you know, maybe overnight you let the roof just kind of organize itself and then come back, and literally the next day you could start doing the details. Yes. Yeah. I know that some of them, you know, you really want to be back down to bare metal. Sorry, everyone. The question was about, there are any issues with any particular metals. It'll stick to kynar and stuff like that. I know that various metals have maybe a different primer. Some of them need to be abraded, this and that. But yeah, it'll stick to every metal. I haven't tried gold, but I believe the rest of them are good. So we don't have time for any more. Does anyone have any questions? Good question. So the question was, does PMMA have any issues tying into other materials? With the exception of TPO and EPDM, it'll stick to other roofing materials. You know, we often use it in a waterproofing transition into an air barrier. They bring the waterproofing up rather than having this whole sort of convoluted exercise there. You can just stop the waterproofing and you bring the air barrier down and keep those two separate, and then just cover the whole seam essentially with a piece of tape, except it's liquid applied PMMA. And then equally, when you're trying to tie the air barrier up into the roof membrane, you can do the same thing, as long as it's not TPO. For some reason, you know, and I know there are chemical differences between PVC and TPO, and evidently one of those is you can't really stick to TPO. And then EPDM, I think it's something to do with the black carbon something or other. But I just know we've got to steer clear of those two, but then essentially anything else is perfectly fine. Right. Yeah, I think it might just pull those out of so it might damage the membrane rather than the PMMA, right? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, so it's a good question about warranties. Like, and we can just go back to, you know, this picture, for instance. You know, just like any manufacturer, if this was, you know, SOPREMA's SBS membrane, torch applied, you know, 6-inch of insulation, SBS vapor barrier on the steel deck, whatever that assembly is, you know, ordinarily, without PMMA, that might be a pitch pocket of some sort, or just some detail that kind of carried the membrane up onto the railing. And, you know, the manufacturer might say, yeah, that's, you know, a maintenance item, that's not really covered. If it leaks through one of these, that's not on us. In this particular situation, because I know this project, the whole thing was kind of talked through during the design. And so before any contracts were even let, the manufacturer had agreed with the owner or the architect that any leaks anywhere on the roof would be covered by the warranty, because we'd agreed that this was going to be the detail. And understanding that this stuff lasts longer than this stuff, which itself lasts a hell of a long time, it's like we don't have any worries about it, you know. But if we got to a job site where we'd sold this and, you know, here's Henry's PMMA or Barrett's PMMA or Seeker's PMMA, we'd be like, no. Yeah, but sure. Right. Right. No, that's right. We have hot rubber and we have PVC, we have modified bitumen, you know. So and most manufacturers do, you know, we go on and on about trying to secure all 6 sides of the building, right? And it really is true. Like, mostly a roof membrane is not going to leak in the field of the roof. It's going to leak where changes plane, where there's a penetration through it, where it connects with another material. You know, there are a lot of places that'll leak. It's unlikely to be in the field. So that's, you know, yes. Mm-hmm. So they're polyurethanes, right? And then you're talking about coatings, or are you talking about roofing system? Yeah, I think that PMMA, it's just a chemistry, right? It's like, ooh, if we put a spoonful of that in, it'll make it a bit, you know, less wobbly, but it might not last as long or whatever. And so I honestly, I'm not really familiar with, I've seen the term and I know it exists.
I know they're different.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we just introduced a bentonite waterproofing, you know, system after 100 years in business. It's like, people want it, fine, we'll get it for you and we'll sell it and we'll sell you a warranty. I mean, it isn't a secret, you know, and just so you know, I mean, you can get a 30-year NDL warranty with this arrangement, or just with this, or just with this. It's really something to consider using when you've got a very specific issue. You know, like, we do not want this to be a problem, you know. I mean, of course, it would be great if you specified it for everything on every project. Everyone would sleep better at night. But, you know, that 2% of project budget might end up being 3%. And that means, you know, less marble in the lobby, and then everyone's upset. So it's a great material. Let's just leave it at that. Appreciate everyone on Teams. I think I'll get certificates out in the next few days. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Please help yourself to a stress reliever if you need it, especially after sitting through.
We're going on like the substrate that you're going, like if you're going into like a things we need to